In a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of town, Mark Davidson's weathered hands tell the story of a life spent fixing everything but his own circumstances. A single father working 3 jobs, he's mastered the art of making broken things whole again. From vintage radios to children's toys, his small workshop has become a sanctuary where the discarded find new life. When he spots Sarah, a quiet 12-year-old from down the street, clutching her shattered flute, something in her dejected expression reminds him of his own daughter. That evening, in his cramped garage workshop, he meticulously repairs the instrument using spare parts and decades of experience. Little does he know that this simple act of kindness is about to change everything. But how could fixing a child's broken flute lead to a helicopter landing on their street the very next morning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aroma of coffee mingled with machine oil as Mark Davidson switched on the lights in his garage workshop at 5:30 a.m. Morning light hadn't yet touched the worn streets of Cedar Grove, but Mark's day was already beginning. He navigated the familiar space with practiced ease, his calloused fingers brushing past shelves of carefully organized tools, each one with its own story, most acquired second-hand over years of bargain hunting and trade deals. A vintage Craftsman wrench set, still in its original red metal case, held pride of place on his workbench. It had been his father's, passed down along with the lessons that would shape his life. Everything can be fixed, son. You just need patience, the right tools, and enough heart to care about doing it right. The workshop itself was a testament to those words. What had started as a simple one-car garage had evolved into a maze of workbenches and storage solutions, each surface hosting projects in various stages of repair. Old radios waited patiently beside modern laptops, their circuits equally mysterious to their owners, but perfectly legible to Mark's experienced eyes. He paused at the coffee maker, another rescue, salvaged from a neighbor's curb and restored to better-than-new condition. The machine now produced a perfect brew every morning, a small victory that started each day with a reminder of what skilled hands could accomplish. "Dad, you're up early again." Emma's voice carried from the doorway, still thick with sleep. At 14, his daughter was already showing signs of the woman she would become, her mother's grace emerging in her features even as she fought with the awkwardness of adolescence. "Just getting a head start, sweetheart. Mrs. Rodriguez's sewing machine needs to be done by noon, and I've got that antique clock from the Hendersons waiting too." He poured a second cup of coffee, adding the splash of cream and 2 sugars exactly the way Emma liked it. "You didn't have to get up yet. It's barely dawn." "I know, but I like our morning time." She accepted the coffee with a small smile that made his heart ache with its familiarity. Catherine had smiled the same way, especially in those quiet moments before the world fully woke. Emma settled into her usual spot, a worn armchair they'd rescued and reupholstered together last summer. It was their first major project as a team, and now it served as her homework station when she helped out after school. The chair's floral pattern didn't quite match anything else in the workshop, but its presence made the space feel more like home. "Besides," she continued, pulling her knees up to her chest, "I have that math test today. Thought maybe I could get in some last-minute studying before the bus comes." Mark wiped his hands on a shop rag and leaned against the workbench. "Want me to quiz you?" "Dad, you're busy. And anyway, I know you've got to finish Mrs. Rodriguez's machine. She needs it for her granddaughter's quinceañera dress." He smiled at his daughter's consideration. "Mrs. Rodriguez can wait 5 minutes. Some things are more important." As they worked through algebra problems between sips of coffee, Mark couldn't help but marvel at how they'd managed to build this life. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The mortgage payments were always tight, and he juggled repair jobs with his part-time work at the hardware store and weekend shifts at the local auto shop. But they had each other, and somehow they made it work. The workshop had become their sanctuary after Catherine passed away 3 years ago. While other men might have sought solace in a bottle or lost themselves in grief, Mark had thrown himself into his repair work. Every broken item that came through his door became a promise he could keep, a way to put something right in a world that sometimes seemed determined to fall apart. Emma understood this in her own way. She'd started spending more time in the workshop after school, first just doing homework, then gradually asking questions about his work. Now she could diagnose simple problems on her own, her young mind often spotting solutions that his experience-bound thinking missed. The morning. Light was growing stronger now, painting their quiet world in shades of amber. Soon, the neighborhood would wake up properly. Mr. Chen would shuffle past on his morning walk, Mrs. Peterson would begin her daily battle with her ancient sprinkler system, and the school bus would rumble down their street promptly at 7:15. "Time to get ready for school," Mark said, glancing at the clock he'd repaired for the community center last month. "You want me to make you some breakfast?" Emma gathered her books, shaking her head. "I'll just grab a granola bar. Don't worry about me, Dad." But worrying about her was as natural as breathing. He watched her disappear into the house, then turned back to his workbench. Mrs. Rodriguez's sewing machine waited, its mechanism frozen with decades of dust and disuse. Mark pulled his tools closer and began the familiar dance of diagnosis and repair, his hands moving with the certainty that came from years of practice. The morning passed in a blur of repairs and phone calls. Between adjusting the timing on the sewing machine and realigning the gears in the Henderson's clock, he took 3 more repair requests and confirmed his weekend shift at the auto shop. It wasn't until he heard the school bus wheeze to a stop outside that he realized he'd worked straight through lunch again. As he watched Emma climb aboard through the workshop window, her backpack slung over one shoulder, Mark sent up a silent prayer of thanks. Despite everything, the long hours, the tight budget, the endless juggling act of single parenthood, they were making it work. And if his daughter could face each day with that quiet strength of hers, then he could keep fixing whatever needed fixing, one broken thing at a time. The afternoon sun filtered through the workshop's dusty windows, casting long shadows across Mark's current project, a 1950s tube radio that had once been the pride of the Miller family. His fingers traced the Art Deco curves of its wooden cabinet as memories surfaced unbidden. Catherine had loved these old radios, especially the way they seemed to breathe life into a room even when silent. "Tell me again how you learned to fix these," Emma said, settling into her after-school spot with homework spread across her lap. She'd heard the story countless times, but some tales never grew old. Mark smiled, carefully removing the radio's back panel. "It started with your grandfather's watch, the one he wore every day for 30 years until it finally stopped ticking." He held up a tiny screwdriver, demonstrating the delicate touch required. "I was about your age when he laid it on the kitchen table and said, 'Mark, some things are worth fixing even when it'd be cheaper to replace them.'" The watch now resided in a small display case on the workshop wall, still keeping perfect time. It had taken him 3 months of studying, practicing, and failing before he finally got it running again. But that process had taught him more than just watch repair. It had shown him the value of persistence. "Your grandfather was right," he continued, carefully extracting the radio's chassis. "These old things, they're not just objects, they're pieces of people's lives, stories waiting to be continued." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Like Mrs. O'Malley's music box?" "Exactly." The music box in question sat on a nearby shelf, awaiting its final polish. It had belonged to Mrs. O'Malley's grandmother, carried over from Ireland in 1912. When she'd brought it in, tears in her eyes and hope in her voice, Mark had recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror all those years ago, working on his father's watch. The workshop had grown alongside his reputation. What began as weekend tinkering had evolved into a steady stream of repairs, each success bringing new challenges through word of mouth. The local antique shops now referred their customers to him for delicate restorations, and more than one museum had consulted him about their mechanical exhibits. "Dad?" Emma's voice pulled him from his reverie. "Do you think maybe I could try fixing something? Something small." Mark's heart swelled with pride and a touch of apprehension. "Of course, sweetheart. Actually, I might have just the thing." He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old pocket compass, its glass cracked, but its brass case still gleaming. "Found this at the flea market last weekend. Thought it might make a good first project." Emma's eyes lit up as she set aside her homework. Mark cleared a space at the second workbench, the one he'd built last summer when she first started showing interest in repairs. It was slightly lower than his, better suited to her height, with its own set of basic tools arranged neatly in a beginner's kit. "First rule of repair," he began, falling naturally into teaching mode, "is to understand what you're working with. Tell me what you see." For the next hour, they worked together, Mark guiding Emma through the process of disassembly and diagnosis. He watched her hands grow steadier with each careful movement, saw the concentration in her furrowed brow that mirrored his own. When she finally managed to remove the cracked glass without damaging the delicate needle beneath, her smile of triumph was worth more than any payment he'd ever received. The workshop phone rang, interrupting their lesson. It was Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant downtown. Their ancient rice cooker had finally given up the ghost in the middle of dinner service. Mark glanced at his watch, then at the pile of ongoing projects. "I can finish cleaning up here," Emma offered, reading his expression. "You should go help Mrs. Chen. She always gives us extra dumplings when we order." Mark hesitated, looking at the compass parts, carefully arranged on Emma's workbench. "You sure?" "Dad, I'm 14, not 4. I promise not to touch anything else, and I'll put everything away exactly how you showed me." He gathered his portable toolkit, another of his father's hand-me-downs, the leather worn soft with age and use. "I shouldn't be more than an hour. There's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you get hungry." "I know, Dad. Go save dinner service." The pride in his chest nearly overwhelmed him as he backed out of the driveway. His daughter was growing up, showing the same careful attention to detail that had served him so well over the years. She was learning not just how to fix things, but why they were worth fixing in the first place. The evening light was fading as he pulled up to the Chen family restaurant, casting long shadows across the busy street. Through the front window, he could see Mrs. Chen directing her staff with the efficiency of a symphony conductor, despite the missing rice cooker. She'd been one of his first regular customers, back when the workshop was just a dream and his tools fit in a single box. As he walked in through the kitchen entrance, nodding to the busy cooks, Mark reflected on how his repair work had woven him into the fabric of their community. Every fixed appliance, every restored heirloom represented a connection, a thread in the tapestry of small-town life that had supported him and Emma through their darkest days. The rice cooker would be a simple fix, he knew, probably just a loose connection or a worn-out heating element, but he'd give it the same attention he gave every repair, because that's what these relationships were built on. Trust, care, and the understanding that sometimes the most important fixes weren't about the objects at all, but about maintaining the bonds between people who depended on each other. Later, driving home with the promised bag of extra dumplings. On the passenger seat, Mark thought about Emma working on that compass. Catherine would have loved seeing their daughter at the workbench, learning the family trade. Some things broke in ways that could never be fixed. That was a lesson he'd learned the hard way, but others could be restored, rebuilt, renewed. And sometimes, if you were lucky, what emerged was even stronger than before. Zara Lynn stood at the bus stop, clutching her flute case as if it were the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. The morning air carried the first hints of autumn, but it wasn't the chill that made her fingers tremble. Inside the battered case, her most precious possession lay broken, its silver body twisted in a way that made her stomach clench every time she thought about it. She hadn't meant to drop it. The case had slipped from her grasp while rushing down the school stairs, and the sickening crack that followed would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. Now, 3 days before the regional youth orchestra auditions, her chances of making first chair seemed as broken as the flute itself. The familiar rumble of the school bus approaching made her shrink further into herself. Being 12 was hard enough without having to explain to her classmates why she'd been crying in the music room during lunch period. The other kids already thought she was strange, the quiet Asian girl who preferred practice rooms to playgrounds. "You okay there, Sarah?" Mr. Davidson's voice carried across his front yard, where he was collecting his morning paper. She'd seen him around the neighborhood, always busy fixing things in his garage workshop. Emma, his daughter, was 2 grades ahead of her at school. Sarah managed a small nod, but her hands tightened around the flute case. The bus was getting closer, and with it, another day of pretending everything was fine. Another day of sitting in orchestra class, unable to play, watching her dream of first chair slip away. "That's your flute, isn't it?" Mr. Davidson had moved closer, his expression kind beneath its usual layer of worry lines. "I've heard you practicing sometimes when I'm working in the garage." Beethoven's Ninth, right? The part from the last movement? Surprise momentarily overcame her anxiety. "You know classical music?" He smiled, and something about it reminded her of her grandfather back in San Francisco. "My late wife, Catherine, she was a music teacher, piano and violin mostly. But she loved all classical music, said it was like mathematics for the soul." The bus was turning onto their street now. Sarah glanced at it, then back at the flute case. Before she could stop herself, words tumbled out in a rush. "It's broken. I dropped it yesterday, and now it's all twisted, and the auditions are on Saturday, and I can't afford to get it fixed because Mum's away on business again, and my aunt doesn't understand why it's so important, and—" She broke off, mortified to feel tears welling up. Mr. Davidson's expression shifted to one of quiet concern. "Would you let me take a look at it? After school, I mean. I fix all sorts of things in my workshop. Maybe I could help." Hope flickered briefly before reality crushed it. "But it's a professional instrument. Mom got it from a special maker in Boston. It's not like fixing a toaster or a radio." "Tell you what," he said as the bus wheezed to a stop beside them. "Bring it by after school anyway. No promises, but sometimes things aren't as unfixable as they seem." Throughout the school day, Sarah's mind kept returning to Mr. Davidson's offer. The flute had been her mother's last gift before the business trips became longer and more frequent. Victoria Lynn was a powerful woman in the international art world, and that meant she was rarely home. Sarah lived with her Aunt Grace, who tried her best but didn't understand why anyone would want to spend hours practicing scales instead of going to the mall. The flute was her connection not just to music, but to her mother. It was a Burkhardt, elite, handcrafted by one of the best flute makers in the country. When her mother had presented it to her last Christmas, she'd said it was an investment in Sarah's future. "Music opens doors," she'd explained, during one of their increasingly rare video calls. "It's a universal language in the circles you'll move in someday." But Sarah didn't care about moving in circles. She cared about the way the flute felt like an extension of her breath, how she could pour all her loneliness and confusion into its silver voice and have it transformed into something beautiful. During long nights when she missed her mom, or days when she felt invisible at school, the flute was her constant companion. In orchestra class, she sat silently while others practiced the audition piece. Her stand partner, Jessica, kept shooting. Her curious looks, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to explain. Jessica was nice enough, but she treated music like just another extracurricular activity, something to put on college applications someday. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah had made up her mind. Mr. Davidson couldn't possibly make things worse than they already were. She walked the 3 blocks to his house, each step measured by the weight of the broken instrument in her hands. Emma answered her tentative knock on the workshop door. "Dad said you might be coming by. Come on in. He's just finishing up with Mrs. Rodriguez's sewing machine." The workshop was nothing like Sarah had imagined. Instead of the cluttered chaos she'd expected, she found an organized space that reminded her of her grandfather's study. Tools hung in careful arrangements on pegboards, and works in progress sat on labeled shelves. The air smelled of coffee and machine oil, with a hint of wood polish. Mr. Davidson looked up from his workbench, where an elderly woman was examining a repaired sewing machine with evident delight. "Ah, Sarah, give me just a minute to finish." "Up here." Sarah watched as he demonstrated the machine's restored functions to Mrs. Rodriguez, explaining each adjustment in patient detail. There was something reassuring about his careful movements, the respect with which he handled the old machine. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, clutching her restored treasure and pressing a bag of homemade tamales into Mr. Davidson's hands, he turned, his full attention to Sarah. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the flute case. She heard his sharp intake of breath at the sight of the bent silver tube, but when she looked up, his expression was thoughtful rather than dismayed. "Tell me about this flute," he said, pulling up a stool. "Sometimes knowing the story helps with the fixing." And so, surrounded by the tools of repair and restoration, Sarah began to tell him about the instrument that meant everything to her, about her mother's long absences, about the upcoming audition that could change everything. As she spoke, she noticed Emma listening from her homework corner and Mr. Davidson taking careful notes in a small notebook, his expression growing more determined with each detail. What she didn't know then was that this moment, this simple act of trust between a broken-hearted girl and a man who believed in fixing broken things, would set in motion events that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in that workshop. Mark Davidson had fixed many things in his life, but never a professional flute. As he gently lifted the Burkhardt Elite from its velvet-lined case, he felt the weight of Sarah's hopes in his hands. The silver tube caught the workshop's evening. Light, its bent surface telling a story of gravity and bad luck. "First thing we need to do," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his inner uncertainty, "is understand exactly what we're dealing with. Emma, could you grab my laptop? We need to do some research." While Emma retrieved the computer, Mark carefully examined the instrument. The main body was bent at a 30-degree angle, but miraculously the keys seemed intact. The delicate mechanism that made the flute sing was a marvel of engineering, dozens of precision-fitted parts working in perfect harmony. Or they would, once he figured out how to straighten the tube without damaging them. "Here, Dad." Emma set up the laptop on a clear corner of the workbench. Sarah hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. For the next hour, they studied flute repair tutorials and technical diagrams. Mark took meticulous notes, occasionally muttering to himself as he compared the online information with the instrument before him. The more he learned, the more he understood the complexity of the task. This wasn't just about straightening metal, it was about preserving the soul of an instrument. "Sarah," he said finally, looking up from his research, "I think I can fix this, but I need you to understand something. This is a professional instrument, and I'm not a professional flute repair technician. If you'd rather wait and take it to a specialist—" "But the audition is Saturday," Sarah interrupted, her voice small but determined. "And I trust you. I've seen how you fix things for everyone else." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her faith. "All right then, Emma, grab my jeweler's loop and—" the small brass hammer from the precision tools drawer. "Sarah, I'd like you to stay and watch if you can. Sometimes it helps to see how things are put right again." As Emma gathered the tools, Mark cleared his main workbench, laying down a soft cloth to protect the flute's silver surface. Under the bright task light, he began the delicate process of documenting every aspect of the damage, photographing the bent section from multiple angles. "The trick with any repair," he explained, falling into his teaching rhythm, "is to understand not just what's broken, but how it's supposed to work when it's whole. Sarah, could you tell us about how the sound is made? What happens when you play? As Sarah described the mechanics of flute playing, the embouchure, the airstream, the precise finger movements, Mark listened intently. Every detail helped him build a mental map of the instrument's needs. This wasn't just about straightening metal. It was about preserving the exact dimensions that made the flute sing. Hours ticked by. Emma made coffee runs and kept Sarah company, the two girls bonding over shared stories of school and music. Mark worked methodically, using techniques adapted from his watch repair experience. He fashioned a custom mandrel to support the tube, carefully heating small sections with a precision torch to relieve stress in the metal. The silver has a memory, he explained as he worked. It wants to return to its original shape. We just have to help it remember, very carefully. Past midnight, Emma had fallen asleep in her armchair, and Sarah was fighting to keep her eyes open. But Mark continued, his movements precise and unhurried. Each adjustment was tested, each alignment checked and rechecked. The workshop's usual sounds, the tick of repaired clocks, the hum of the overhead light, formed a quiet symphony behind his work. At 2 a.m, he set down his tools and picked up his phone. "Sarah, I need to call your aunt. She must be worried sick." Sarah startled from her half-doze. "Oh, I texted her earlier. She's working night shift at the hospital, so she said it was okay as long as I'm safe." Mark frowned slightly but nodded. He'd have to have a conversation with Aunt Grace about proper supervision, but that could wait. Right now, he was nearly done with the most critical part of the repair. "Emma," he called softly, waking his daughter, "take Sarah into the house and fix her something to eat. I need about 30 more minutes here." While the girls were gone, Mark completed the final adjustments. Each key was tested for smooth action, each pad checked for proper seating. The silver surface, carefully polished, now gleamed as if new, but the true test would come with the first note played. When Sarah returned, her eyes wide with exhaustion and hope, Mark had just finished reassembling the case. "Now, before you try it, remember that it might need some adjustments. We can fine-tune things tomorrow after you've had a chance to practice with it." Sarah lifted the flute with trembling hands. The workshop held its breath as she assembled the pieces and raised the instrument to her lips. The first note, a clear, pure B-flat, brought tears to her eyes. It's perfect," she whispered, running through a scale. Each note rang true, the mechanism moving smoothly under her fingers. "How did you—" Mark smiled, fatigue and satisfaction mingling in his expression. "Everything can be fixed if you care enough to learn how. Now let's get you home. Emma and I will walk you. It's too late for anyone to be out alone." As they walked Sarah home through the quiet streets, Mark carrying her flute case while she dozed against Emma's shoulder, he reflected on the night's work. He'd pushed the boundaries of his skills, learned new techniques, and most importantly, helped a young musician find her voice again. Back in the workshop, clearing away his tools in the pre-dawn quiet, Mark found himself humming a tune, one of Catherine's favorites. She would have loved this repair, he thought, would have understood exactly why it was worth staying up all night to fix a young girl's broken dreams. Emma, fighting sleep but unwilling to leave her father alone, helped with the cleanup. "Dad?" she asked, placing the precision tools back in their drawer. "Do you think Sarah will win the audition?" Mark thought about the determination he'd seen in Sarah's eyes, the way she'd watched every step of the repair process with such intensity. "I think she's got as good a chance as anyone. But win or lose, she'll play her best. Sometimes that's all we can do, give people back the chance to try." As the first hints of dawn began to color the workshop windows, father and daughter finally headed inside, leaving behind the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and the lingering notes of Sarah's test scale still echoing in their memories. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with October sunlight painting Cedar Grove in shades of gold. Mark had managed only 3 hours of sleep before his internal clock roused him for another day of repairs. His hands still held the memory of the flute's delicate mechanisms as he made his morning coffee. The local news played quietly on the kitchen radio, another rescue from his workshop. The announcer's voice droned on about business mergers and stock prices until a familiar name caught his attention. And in international art news, Victoria Lin's latest acquisition for the Chen Global Arts Foundation has set another record at auction. The renowned curator and CEO continues her mission to democratize access to fine art. Mark nearly dropped his coffee cup. Lin, Sarah's mother's name was Lin. He turned up the volume, but the segment had already moved on to weather reports. Something tugged at his memory, a half-formed connection he couldn't quite grasp. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Turn on Channel 7 now." Curious, he flicked on the small TV he kept in the kitchen for Emma's breakfast cartoons. The morning show was running a feature on women changing the art world, and there, speaking confidently to the camera, was a striking Asian woman in her early 40s. The caption read, "Victoria Lin, CEO Chen Global Arts Foundation." The resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable. "Dad!" Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school. "Why are you staring at the TV like that?" Before he could answer, the workshop phone began ringing. It was barely 7 a.m., far too early for his usual customers. He grabbed it on the third ring. "Mark, it's Grace, Sarah's aunt." The voice on the other line was breathless with excitement. "I just got off the phone with my sister. Victoria's coming home today. She saw Sarah's social media post about the flute repair and—" "Social media post?" Mark interrupted, confused. "Oh, you haven't seen it? Sarah posted a video last night of her playing the fixed flute. It's gone viral in the classical music community." Victoria's executive assistant follows Sarah's account to keep tabs on her, and when they realized what happened, the rest of Grace's explanation was lost in a sudden commotion outside. Mark walked to the workshop window, phone still pressed to his ear, and felt his jaw drop. A small crowd had gathered at the end of his driveway. Several held phones aloft, recording. In their midst stood Sarah, playing her flute with a confidence he hadn't seen before. The morning air carried the notes of what he recognized as Bach's Partita in a minor, the piece she'd been practicing for her audition. Each phrase was crystal clear, the instrument responding perfectly to her touch. But it was her expression that caught his heart, pure joy, unmarred by yesterday's worry and fear. Emma had joined him at the window. "Dad, she's trending on Twitter. The video has over 1 million views already." Mark's mind struggled to process this information. He was a simple repairman who believed in fixing things properly and treating people right. Viral videos and social media trends belonged to a different world entirely. The performance ended to enthusiastic applause from the growing crowd. Sarah lowered her flute, beaming, then caught sight of Mark in the window. She waved excitedly, gesturing for him to come outside. "Mr. Davidson!" she called as he stepped onto his porch. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep last night, so I made a video thanking you and showing how perfectly you fixed it. I only shared it with my music friends, but then they shared it, and then some really famous flautists shared it, and then—" She trailed off as a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The crowd parted as a professionally dressed woman emerged from the back seat, her designer heels clicking on the pavement. Sarah's eyes widened. "Mom!" Victoria Lin moved with the assurance of someone used to commanding attention. But as she approached her daughter, Mark saw something else in her expression: relief, love, and perhaps a touch of regret. "I saw your video, sweetheart," she said softly. "It was all over my news feeds this morning. When I realized what happened to your flute, and then saw how this gentleman had fixed it." She turned to Mark, extending her hand. "Mr. Davidson, I presume? I'd very much like to thank you properly for helping my daughter." Before Mark could respond, more vehicles began arriving. A news van pulled up, followed by several expensive-looking cars. His quiet neighborhood was rapidly becoming a circus. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," he suggested, gesturing toward the workshop. "Emma, could you put on Some coffee? I have a feeling we're going to need it." As they moved inside, Mark caught fragments of conversation from the gathering crowd. Someone mentioned the Chen Global Arts Foundation's recent $100 million initiative to support community arts programs. Another voice spoke about Victoria Lynn's reputation for transforming struggling arts organizations into world-class institutions, but what held his attention was Sarah's face as she watched her mother examine the workshop. There was hope there, and uncertainty, and a desperate desire for connection. Mark recognized that look. He'd seen it in Emma's eyes in the months after Catherine's passing, when their world had seemed broken beyond repair. The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like silent music notes. Mark's various projects sat waiting on their shelves: Mrs. Henderson's antique clock, Mr. Chen's rice cooker, young Tommy's remote control car. Each one represented a small piece of trust placed in his hands, a faith that he could make broken things whole again. Now, as Victoria Lynn stood in his workshop with her designer suit and world-changing influence, Mark wondered if perhaps he'd fixed something far more important than a flute. Sometimes the most crucial repairs weren't about the objects at all, but about the connections between people who had drifted apart. Emma returned with coffee cups, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and Mark could hear phones ringing in multiple directions. Something big was about to happen. He could feel it in the air like the pressure change before a storm. But for now, in this moment, he simply watched as mother and daughter stood close together, their hands both resting on the flute case that had brought them back to each other's world. The morning's quiet chaos erupted into full-blown pandemonium at precisely 9:17 a.m., when the distinctive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades shattered Cedar Grove's peaceful atmosphere. The sleek black aircraft appeared over the rooftops, bearing the Chen Global Arts Foundation logo in gleaming gold letters along its side. Mark stood in his driveway, coffee cup still in hand, watching in disbelief as the helicopter circled once before setting down in the empty lot at the end of his street. The downdraft sent leaves swirling in miniature tornadoes, and several of the gathered onlookers scrambled to keep their phones steady as they recorded the unexpected arrival. "That would be the board members," Victoria Lynn said calmly, as if corporate helicopters routinely landed in suburban neighborhoods. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Davidson, but after seeing Sarah's video, they insisted on coming immediately. We were in the middle of our quarterly meeting when the story broke." Emma edged closer to her father. "Dad, is this really happening?" Before Mark could answer, the helicopter's door slid open, and three distinguished-looking individuals emerged. The first was an elderly Asian man who moved with deliberate grace, his silver hair ruffled by the dying rotor wash. Behind him came a tall woman in her 60s, wearing what looked like an orchestra conductor's outfit, complete with a silk scarf that fluttered dramatically in the wind. The third was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, carrying a laptop, and looking simultaneously excited and apologetic. "Sarah," the elderly man called out, his face breaking into a warm smile. "You're playing in that video. Magnificent! The tone you achieved after the repair." He turned to Mark, extending his hand. "Mr. Davidson, I'm James Chen. That flute you fixed? I was there in Boston when it was made. The craftsman who created it is a personal friend." Mark shook the offered hand, feeling increasingly like he'd stepped into an alternate reality. "I just did what needed doing, sir. Sarah needed her flute for the audition and—" "Exactly." The woman in the conductor's outfit stepped forward. "That's precisely why we're here. I'm Margaret Woodward, director of the New England Conservatory of Music. When I saw that video, the dedication to get it fixed, the quality of the repair, the pure joy in Sarah's playing, I knew we had to act quickly." The younger man, with the laptop, had set up a small mobile workstation on the hood of a nearby car. "The video's at 12 million views now," he reported. "Comments are overwhelmingly positive. The hashtag #GFloralParkFlute is trending nationwide, and we're seeing significant engagement from the classical music community. Victoria Lynn nodded approvingly. "Thank you, David." She turned to Mark. "Mr. Davidson, Mark, what you did last night, staying up until dawn to repair Sarah's flute. That's exactly the kind of dedication to craft and community that the Chen Foundation was created to support." The growing crowd of neighbors had pressed closer, phones still recording every moment. Mark spotted Mrs. Rodriguez dabbing at her, eyes with her apron, and Mr. Chen from the restaurant was rapidly speaking in Mandarin to someone on his phone, gesturing excitedly at the helicopter. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, her flute case clutched to her chest, looking between her mother and Mark with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. Emma had moved to stand beside her, the two girls sharing looks that seemed to say, "Can you believe this?" James Chen cleared his throat. "Mr. Davidson, we'd like to make you a proposal, but first..." He turned to Sarah. "Young lady, would you play for us again, here in the morning light with your mother present?" Sarah glanced at Mark, who gave her an encouraging nod. With trembling fingers, she assembled her flute, took a deep breath, and began to play. The Bach partita soared into the morning air, each note crystalline and pure. But this time, there was something more, a confidence, a joy that hadn't been there before. The music spoke of broken things made whole, of connections restored, of hope taking flight. Victoria Lynn's composed facade cracked slightly as she watched her daughter play. Mark saw her hand move to her throat, saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes. He understood then that it wasn't just the flute that had needed fixing. The piece ended to appreciative applause from the assembled crowd. Margaret Woodward was practically bouncing with excitement. "The tone, the phrasing, my dear, with proper training." "That's part of what we'd like to discuss," James Chen interjected smoothly. He gestured to Mark's workshop. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside? What we're proposing will require some explanation." As they moved toward the workshop, David, the young man with the laptop, called out, "Ms. Lynn, CNN is asking for an exclusive, and the Symphony Hall Foundation wants to know if Sarah would consider performing at their annual gala next month." Mark paused at his workshop door, looking back at the surreal scene. The helicopter gleaming in the morning sun, the crowd of neighbors still recording everything. The news vans now double-parked along his quiet suburban street. Emma caught his eye and mouthed, "Oh my God, Dad!" Inside, his familiar workshop seemed suddenly small and humble compared to the distinguished group now gathering within it. But then he noticed how James Chen was admiringly examining his tool organization system, how Margaret Woodward was peering with interest at the antique radio he'd been restoring, how Victoria Lynn was running a finger gently along his workbench with something like respect. "Mr. Davidson," James Chen said, settling into one of the workshop's chairs, "how would you feel about expanding your operations? The Chen Foundation has been looking to establish a technical arts training center, focusing on instrument repair and restoration. What you did with Sarah's flute, that's the kind of skill and dedication we want to preserve and pass on to the next generation." Mark's mind spun. "Sir, I'm just a repairman. I'm not—" "You're an artist," Margaret Woodward interrupted. "A preservationist. Do you know how many priceless instruments are deteriorating because there aren't enough skilled craftsmen to maintain them? What you did with that flute, that's becoming a lost art." Victoria Lynn stepped forward. "We're prepared to make a significant investment, both in your workshop and in Sarah's future. If you're willing to teach others your skills, to help build something larger than yourself." She glanced at her daughter, who was still holding her flute like a lifeline. "Sometimes the most important things in life need repair. Sometimes we need someone to show us how to make things whole again." The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. Mark looked at Emma, saw the pride and excitement in her eyes. He looked at Sarah, saw the hope and possibility in her smile, and he thought about all the broken things in the world, waiting for someone to care enough to fix them. Victoria Lynn sat in Mark's workshop, her designer suit incongruous against the worn leather of the client chair, studying the wall of completed repairs. Each item had a small tag noting its history. Thompson Family Radio, 1952. Miller's grandfather. Clock, 1887. Emily's music box, wedding gift, 1943. Behind each label lay a story, a connection, a piece of life restored. "You document everything," she observed, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who'd spent years in international boardrooms. "Details matter," Mark replied simply, setting a fresh cup of coffee before her. The others had gone outside. James Chen to make some calls, Margaret Woodward to discuss preliminary audition arrangements with Sarah, and Emma to help David manage the growing media presence. "Yes," Victoria said softly. "They do." She turned the coffee cup in her hands, her perfect manicure catching the workshop's light. "I used to document everything about Sarah too. Her first steps, first words, first piano lesson. I have albums, full of photographs, all carefully labeled and dated. But somewhere along the way," she trailed off, staring at the wall of repairs. Mark waited, recognizing the look of someone trying to find the words to explain a complicated break. "You know, I grew up in a 2-room apartment above my father's repair shop in San Francisco," she finally continued. "He fixed watches, mostly. Tiny, intricate works that required perfect patience. I used to watch him for hours, learning to be still, to observe. He always said that understanding how something broke was the first step. In making it whole again," Mark nodded, thinking of his own father's lessons. "Wise man." He was. When he died last year, I found his logbooks. Decades of repairs, all documented just like yours. She gestured at Mark's wall. "But what struck me wasn't the technical details. It was the notes about the people, who they were, why the item mattered to them, what story it held." Through the workshop window, they could see Sarah playing her flute for a small group of entranced neighbors. The morning sun caught the silver instrument, making it shimmer. "That flute," Victoria said, watching her daughter. "I bought it thinking it would give her an advantage, open doors. What I didn't realize was that she needed it for something else entirely." Her composed facade cracked slightly. "She was using it to speak to me, wasn't she? All those videos she posted, the pieces she chose to play. Children find their own ways to reach out," Mark said gently, thinking of Emma's gradual migration into his workshop after Catherine's death. "Sometimes they need a different kind of tool to express what they're feeling." Victoria's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "When I saw her video last night, the way she looked when she played that first note after you fixed it, I realized I'd broken something far more precious than a flute. I've been so focused on building this legacy, this foundation, that would democratize access to the arts." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "And all the while, I was missing the most important audience of all." Mark moved to his workbench, picked up the notebook where he documented the flute repair. "Would you like to see how we fixed it?" he offered. Sarah watched every step. She understood the process, asked intelligent questions. "She has your father's eye for detail, I think." Victoria took the notebook with trembling hands, reading through the careful notes and diagrams. "She does, doesn't she? I never made the connection, but the way she approaches music, it's exactly how my father approached his repairs. Patient, methodical, seeking to understand the whole before addressing the parts." Outside, Sarah had finished playing. Through the window, they could see her deep in conversation with Margaret Woodward, her face animated as she discussed technique and interpretation. Emma stood nearby, beaming with pride at her new friend's success. "Mr. Davidson," Victoria began, then corrected herself. "Mark, what you've proposed, teaching others, preserving these repair skills, it's exactly what the foundation needs. But I think perhaps it's also what Sarah and I need. A way to understand how things break and how they can be fixed." She stood, smoothing her suit with an automatic gesture. "The foundation can provide everything you need to expand: space, equipment, apprentices. We'll set up scholarships, create a proper curriculum. But, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Would you be willing to take on 2 students who need to learn about more than just repairs? Mark thought about his own journey with Emma, how working side by side at the bench had helped them rebuild their life after Catherine's death, how the simple act of fixing broken things had given them a language to discuss their own healing. Every repair starts with understanding, he said, echoing her father's wisdom, and sometimes the most important fixes aren't the ones you can see. Victoria's carefully maintained composure softened into a genuine smile. My father used to say something similar. He'd tell me, Tori, everything that's broken teaches us something about being whole. She looked out at Sarah again, her expression wistful. I think perhaps it's time I learned that lesson again. The workshop's familiar sounds surrounded them. The tick of restored clocks, the hum of machinery, the distant notes of Sarah's flute as she demonstrated a passage for Margaret Woodward. Each sound representing something broken made whole again, a story continuing rather than ending. Well then, Mark said, pulling out his lesson planner, another of Catherine's influences on his work. Shall we start designing our first class? Victoria Lynn, the powerful CEO who could summon helicopters and move millions with a signature, sat down at Mark's workbench like an eager student. Together they began to plan not just a curriculum for repair work, but perhaps something more, a way to fix the delicate mechanisms of family, of trust, of love that had been damaged by time and distance. Outside, the morning continued to unfold in unexpected ways, but here in the workshop, surrounded by the tools of repair and restoration, 2 parents were quietly laying the groundwork for something remarkable, a future where broken things, be they flutes or relationships, could find their way back to harmony. The workshop had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. James Chen sat at Mark's workbench, his laptop open to a PowerPoint presentation that seemed strangely corporate in the homey space. Margaret Woodward perched on Emma's homework chair, her conductor's scarf draped dramatically over its floral pattern. Victoria and Sarah sat together on the small repair waiting bench, their shoulders touching in a way that seemed both tentative and hopeful. Let me outline what we're proposing, James began, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone used to making big things happen. The Chen Foundation has been searching for the right opportunity to launch our technical arts preservation initiative. What we've seen here, the skill, the dedication, the community impact, it's exactly what we've been looking for. He turned his laptop so everyone could see the architectural renderings on the screen. We envision transforming this entire block into the Center for Technical Arts Restoration. The existing workshop would become the heart of it, of course, but expanded and properly equipped. Mark's eyes widened at the images. His humble workshop had been reimagined as a beautiful blend of traditional craftsmanship and modern education space. The plans showed multiple workstations, a lecture area, and what appeared to be a small concert space. The music performance area was my suggestion, Margaret interjected eagerly. We've found that understanding how instruments work, how they're maintained and repaired, makes students better musicians, and vice versa. Musicians often have insights that help technicians understand the instruments better. Victoria stepped in smoothly, her business acumen evident. The foundation is prepared to make an initial investment of $5 million. This would cover the property acquisition, building renovation, equipment, and the first year's operating, and costs, including staff salaries. She paused, looking directly at Mark. We want you, as the Director of Technical Education, with full autonomy over the curriculum and training methods. Emma, who had been quiet until now, spoke up from her corner. What about the neighbors? Mrs. Rodriguez's house, Mr. Chen's. They've lived here forever. James smiled warmly. An excellent question, young lady. We've actually thought about that. He clicked to the next slide. Part of our community integration plan includes offering the current residents several options. They can sell their properties at well above market value, or they can become part of the project. We're looking at creating living spaces above the workshop areas for resident artisans and students. Sarah's face lit up. Like your father's watch shop, Mom. Remember you told me how you lived above it? Victoria's expression softened at her daughter's enthusiasm. Exactly like that, sweetheart. In fact, that's partly what inspired this aspect of the plan. Mark ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the scope of what was being proposed. It's incredible, but I'm just a repairman. Teaching a few apprentices is one thing, but running an entire school? Margaret leaned forward intently. That's precisely why we want you, Mr. Davidson. You understand that this isn't just about technical skills. It's about preservation, about connecting people to their precious objects and memories. We've seen how you document everything, how you take the time to understand not just what's broken, but what the repair means to people. Besides, James added, you wouldn't be alone. We're assembling a team of administrative support staff, and Victoria has agreed to serve as executive director, handling the business aspects while you focus on the technical and educational components. Mark glanced at Victoria, surprised. She nodded confirmation. I'm relocating the Foundation's East Coast office here. It's time I was closer to home. Her hand found Sarah's and squeezed gently. David, who had been quietly taking notes on his tablet, spoke up. The social media response has been extraordinary. The Floral Park Flute is still trending, and we're getting inquiries from potential students and artisans worldwide. There's clearly a demand for this kind of traditional craftsmanship education. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting warm light across the workshop's organized chaos. Mark looked around at his lifetime of work, the tools, the projects in various stages of repair, the wall of documentation that told the stories of countless items made whole again. Then he looked at the faces around him, Emma's excited anticipation, Sarah's hopeful smile, Victoria's newfound warmth, James and Margaret's earnest enthusiasm. Could I have a moment? He asked quietly. Just to think. Of course, James replied. Why don't we all step outside? I believe the local news crew was hoping to get some footage of Sarah playing her flute anyway. As the others filed out, Emma lingered. Dad? What do you think Mom would say about all this? Mark's throat tightened. Catherine had always believed in him, had encouraged him to teach others even when he doubted himself. She'd been the one who suggested he start documenting his repairs, saying that someday those stories might matter to more than just his customers. I think, he said slowly, she would tell me that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build something new with it. Emma nodded, her eyes bright. That sounds like Mom. She hugged him quickly, then stepped back. For what it's worth, I think you should do it. Not just for us, but for all the other broken things out there waiting to be fixed. Through the window, Mark could see Sarah playing her flute again, her mother watching with undisguised pride. The gathered crowd had grown, neighbors mingling with news crews and Foundation staff. Mrs. Rodriguez was passing out homemade tamales, while Mr. Chen from the restaurant gestured animatedly as he talked with James about the project. This wasn't just about fixing objects anymore. It was about preserving knowledge, building community, creating opportunities for healing and growth. It was about taking everything he'd learned about repair, about patience, about understanding, about the importance of getting the details right and using it to make something larger than himself. Mark touched the worn leather of his tool pouch, thinking of all the repairs it had helped him complete over the years. Then he thought of all the repairs still waiting to be made, all the stories still waiting to be continued. He stepped to the door and beckoned James and Victoria back. Inside. I have some ideas about the curriculum, he said simply, and about how we can make this work for everyone. Their faces broke into matching smiles, and Mark knew that this was the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would take all his skill, all his patience, all his heart. But then, weren't those the ingredients of every worthwhile repair? That evening, after the news crews had departed and the helicopter had lifted off in a swirl of autumn leaves, the Davidson home settled into an unusual quiet. Mark and Emma sat at their kitchen table, a pile of foundation documents between them, sharing a pizza that Mrs. Rodriguez had insisted on sending over. "They're offering full college scholarships," Emma said, pointing to one of the papers with a pizza-greasy finger. "Not just for me, but for any children of the staff. And look, there's a whole section about apprenticeships for local students." Mark nodded, still processing the day's events. "It's generous, almost too generous." "Dad," Emma put down her slice and fixed him with a look that was pure Catherine. "Are you thinking about saying no? Because if you are, that would be crazy. Like actually crazy." A knock at the back door interrupted his response. Sarah and Victoria stood on the steps, carrying what appeared to be an elaborate dessert box from the city's finest bakery. "We come bearing stress food," Victoria announced, her corporate polish softened by a tentative smile. "I remember your wife mentioned once that you loved tiramisu, Mark, in that interview she did for the local paper about the workshop." Mark blinked in surprise. "You found that article?" "I had David pull everything he could find about the workshop's history," Victoria admitted. "I like to be thorough in my research." She paused, then added more softly, "And I wanted to understand the legacy we're asking you to build upon." They cleared space at the table, and Emma brought out plates and forks. The tiramisu was indeed excellent, but more important was the comfortable silence that settled over them as they ate. 4 people whose lives had been unexpectedly intertwined by a broken flute and a late-night repair. "I received 17 messages from other parents at Sarah's school today," Victoria said finally, "all asking if you could look at their children's instruments. Apparently, there's quite a backlog of repairs needed, but most technicians either charge too much or aren't taking new clients." "That's true," Sarah added. "Jessica from orchestra. Her violin has a crack that's getting worse, but her mum said the repair shop in the city quoted 3 months wait time." Mark thought about his own growing wait list, the careful juggling of projects and priorities. "There's definitely a need, but this plan of yours, it's so much bigger than just instrument repair." "It has to be," Victoria responded. "What you do here, it's not just about fixing things. It's about preserving skills, building community, keeping stories alive. The foundation can provide resources and structure, but we need your heart, your understanding of why these repairs matter." Emma cleared her throat. "Can I say something?" When everyone nodded, she continued, "Mum used to tell her students that music isn't just about playing notes. It's about connecting people, sharing emotions, making something beautiful together. Isn't that what you do too, Dad? You don't just fix things. You help people keep their connections to what matters." Sarah nodded eagerly. "That's what I tried to show in my video. It wasn't just about the flute being fixed. It was about how Mr. Davidson understood why it mattered so much." A comfortable breeze drifted through the kitchen window, carrying the familiar evening sounds of their neighborhood. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant rumble of commuter trains. This was home, Mark thought. But maybe home could grow, could embrace something new while keeping its heart intact. "If we do this," he said slowly, "I have some conditions." Victoria straightened, suddenly alert. "Of course, name them." "First, we preserve the character of the neighborhood. No one gets pushed out who wants to stay. And we find a way to integrate the existing businesses, Mr. Chen's restaurant, Mrs. Rodriguez's alteration shop, all of them. Already part of the plan," Victoria assured him. "James is quite passionate about community preservation." "Second," Mark continued, "the training stays hands-on, personal. No mass production, no cutting corners. Every repair gets the time and attention it needs. Every student learns the whole process." "That's exactly why we want you in charge of the curriculum," Victoria said. "Your methods, your standards." "And third," Mark looked at Emma, who nodded encouragement. We establish a scholarship fund in Catherine's name for students who might not otherwise have access to music education or instrument repair training. Victoria's eyes softened. I think we can do even better than that. What would you think about naming the performance space the Catherine Davidson Memorial Hall? A place where repaired instruments can sing again. Emma's eyes welled up, and even Sarah, who had never known Catherine, looked touched. Mark felt something shift in his heart. Not a breaking, but a gentle expansion, like an old mechanism, finding new purpose. Well then, he said, his voice a bit rough, I suppose we should start planning how to tell the neighbors. Already taken care of, Emma grinned. Mrs. Rodriguez has been texting everyone all day. They're all meeting at Mr. Chen's restaurant tomorrow night to discuss it. The whole neighborhood's talking about nothing else. Victoria smiled. Community support will be crucial. Perhaps Sarah could play something at the meeting. Show them what's possible when skill and care come together. As they continued talking, making plans and sharing ideas, Mark watched the easy interaction between mother and daughter, the growing friendship between Emma and Sarah, the way their small kitchen seemed to expand to hold these new possibilities. Sometimes he realized the most important decisions weren't really decisions at all, but simply recognition of a path that had been waiting all along. Like finding the right tool for a complex repair, or hearing the perfect note from a restored instrument. When it was right, you just knew. Tomorrow would bring challenges and changes, meetings and plans, the complex work of building something new. But for now, in this moment, 4 people shared dessert and dreams in a comfortable kitchen, while outside, a neighborhood held its breath in anticipation of what their quiet street might become. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mark's workshop, once a quiet sanctuary of careful repairs, now buzzed with the energy of transformation. Architects came and went, their rolled-up plans tucked under their arms as they measured spaces and discussed possibilities. But Mark insisted that the repair work continue even as the planning progressed. Life doesn't stop for change, he explained to Emma as they worked together on a violin that had come in that morning. Neither do broken things stop needing repair. The violin belonged to Jessica, Sarah's orchestra friend, and Mark had made it a priority, a small gesture that seemed to carry larger meaning. Emma watched as her father examined the crack with his jeweler's loupe, his practiced hands gentle against the aged wood. "See here," he said, pointing to where the crack met a grain line. "This is why we're doing this. Every repair tells a story, teaches a lesson. In a classroom, this violin could help a dozen students understand wood behavior under stress." Victoria had taken to spending her afternoons in the workshop, set up in a corner with her laptop, orchestrating the project's logistics while absorbing the rhythm of repair work. She'd moved into a temporary apartment nearby with Sarah, and the change in both of them was remarkable. "The foundation board approved the initial budget this morning," she announced, looking up from her screen. "Construction can begin next month, assuming the permits come through." Mark nodded, carefully applying hide glue to the violin's crack. "Just in time for winter. Speaking of which, how did Sarah's audition go?" Victoria's face broke into a proud smile. "First chair. Margaret was right. Her playing has transformed since everything happened. She says she understands her instrument differently now, after watching you work." The bell above the workshop door chimed as Mrs. Rodriguez entered, carrying her usual basket of fresh tamales. But today she wasn't alone. Behind her came Mr. Chen from the restaurant and old Mr. Patterson, who ran the bookstore on the corner. "We've been talking," Mrs. Rodriguez announced, setting down her basket, "about the changes coming, and we have some ideas." Mr. Chen stepped forward, unfolding a hand-drawn map of their block. "If you're going to teach people about repairs, they need to eat. My restaurant, we could expand, add a proper cafe for the students, Anna's tamales, my dumplings, and my shop could become a technical library," Mr. Patterson added. "I've been collecting books on craftsmanship and repair. Techniques for 40 years, might as well put them to good use." Mark looked at their eager faces. then at Victoria, who was already making notes on her tablet. The foundation's budget could certainly accommodate community integration projects, she said. In fact, it's exactly the kind of organic growth James was hoping for. Emma, who had been quietly cleaning tools, spoke up. What if we did a community festival to launch everything? Sarah could play and Dad could do repair demonstrations and everyone could see how it's all going to work. Together, the idea caught fire immediately. Mrs. Rodriguez began planning menus, Mr. Chen started calculating seating arrangements, and Mr. Patterson promised to curate a special display of technical manuscripts. As the workshop filled with excited conversation and planning, Mark felt Catherine's absence sharply. She would have loved this, the coming together of community, the sharing of skills and dreams. But perhaps, he thought, watching Emma confidently discuss festival logistics with their neighbors, her spirit was still here, living on in the connections being forged and the care being taken with precious things. Later, after everyone had gone, Mark sat at his workbench, making his usual detailed notes about the violin repair. But today, he added something new, a small paragraph about the workshop's transformation, about the way repair work was expanding, to heal not just broken objects, but a community's bonds. Sometimes, he wrote, the most important restorations aren't the ones we plan for, but the ones that find us when we're ready to grow. The first real test of their grand vision came on a crisp November morning when the construction crews arrived. The steady rhythm of hammer and saw replaced the quieter sounds of Mark's repair work, and dust from the renovation next door crept into every corner of the workshop despite their best efforts to seal the windows. Maybe we should temporarily relocate, Victoria suggested, watching Mark wipe construction dust off a precious Stradivarius violin that had just arrived for restoration. The instrument's owner, a touring virtuoso, had read about the workshop online and flown in specifically to entrust it to Mark's care. No, Mark said firmly, carefully replacing the violin in its case. People know where to find us here. They trust this place. We adapt, but we don't stop. Emma had taken to wearing a dust mask while doing her homework, making her look like a young surgeon bent over her textbooks, but she didn't complain, even when the power saw next door drowned out her music practice. "Dad," she called out one afternoon, "there's someone here to see you about an apprenticeship." The young man who entered wore clothes that had seen better days, but his eyes were keen and his hands, Mark noticed, showed signs of careful work. "Name's Miguel Rodriguez," he said. "I'm Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson. I've been fixing cars since I was 12, but what you're doing here, this is what I want to learn." Mark glanced at the half-demolished wall, the construction chaos, then back at Miguel's earnest face. "We're not exactly set up for teaching yet." "I don't mind," Miguel replied. "I can help with the construction too. I want to be part of this from the beginning." Victoria, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "We could create a pilot apprenticeship program," she suggested. "Work out the curriculum details with actual students before the formal launch." And so, amid the dust and noise of construction, the first class of the Technical Arts Center began with a single student. Miguel proved to be a natural, his mechanical background giving him an intuitive understanding of how things worked, or didn't work. "It's like a symphony," he said one day, carefully dismantling a music box mechanism. "All these parts working together to make something beautiful." Sarah, who had taken to spending her after-school hours in the workshop, looked up from her flute practice. "That's exactly what it's like. When one thing's out of alignment, you can hear it in the whole piece." The construction brought other changes too. Mr. Chen's restaurant now served lunch to the construction crews, testing new recipes for the future cafe. Mr. Patterson had begun cataloguing his technical books, discovering rare volumes that would prove invaluable to future students, but with growth came challenges. The parking situation became a nightmare, with construction vehicles competing for space with repair clients. The noise made delicate work more difficult, and Mark found himself working later into the evenings when things were quieter. One night, As he was finishing up a particularly tricky clock repair, he found Emma asleep at her homework desk, a half-finished essay about community transformation on her laptop screen. Carefully, he draped his work jacket over her shoulders, just as he used to do when she was smaller. "You know," Victoria's voice came softly from the doorway, "we could hire someone to help with the basic repairs, give you more time to develop the teaching program." Mark shook his head. "Every repair is a lesson, even the simple ones. That's something my father taught me. There's no such thing as a basic repair when it matters to someone." Victoria nodded, understanding. She'd been learning too, rediscovering the patience she'd known in her father's watch shop. Sarah asked if she could invite some of her orchestra friends to see the renovation progress, she said. "They're all curious about where they'll be able to bring their instruments for maintenance." "Of course," Mark replied, making a mental note to clear some space for visitors. They should see that good things can come from temporary chaos. Outside, the construction lights cast long shadows across the workshop floor, while the evening breeze carried the mingled sense of sawdust and Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking. Change was happening, faster than anyone had expected, but at its heart, the workshop remained what it had always been, a place where broken things could be made whole. Again, where stories continued rather than ended. Miguel would return tomorrow for another lesson. Sarah would practice her flute in whatever quiet corner she could find, and Emma would keep documenting everything in her journal, capturing this transformation one day at a time. The dust would settle, the walls would rise, and somehow they would all grow together into something new and stronger than before. The day of the community festival dawned clear and cool, with just enough autumn crispness in the air to make the hot chocolate and cider stations popular. Mr. Chen had transformed the construction site into an outdoor cafe space with strings of lights crisscrossing overhead and the aroma of both Chinese and Mexican cuisine mingling invitingly. Mark stood in his workshop doorway, taking in the scene. The construction crews had worked overtime to ensure the site was presentable, and temporary platforms created spaces for demonstrations and performances. Mr. Patterson's technical book display occupied one corner, featuring everything from Victorian repair manuals to modern conservation texts. "Ready?" Emma appeared beside him, carrying his tool belt. She'd polished every implement until they gleamed, a small gesture that touched him deeply, almost. He adjusted his collar, conscious of the new shirt Victoria had insisted he wear for the occasion. "Is Sarah prepared for her performance?" "Mom's helping her warm up behind Mr. Chen's restaurant," Emma replied, the word "mom" slipping out naturally in reference to Victoria. Neither of them commented on it, but Mark felt a warm flutter in his chest at this sign of their evolving family dynamic. The festival had drawn a larger crowd than expected. Music students and their parents mingled with local residents and professional musicians who'd heard about the Technical Arts Centre. James Chen circulated through the crowd with Margaret Woodward, while David live-streamed the event for the Foundation's social media. Miguel had set up a repair demonstration station, carefully showing visitors the basics of mechanism maintenance. His grandmother watched proudly from her tamale stand, occasionally calling out suggestions in Spanish. "Mr. Davidson," a young violin student tugged at his sleeve, "could you show us how you fixed Jessica's violin, the one with the crack?" Before he knew it, Mark was surrounded by eager faces as he demonstrated the repair techniques he'd used. Victoria appeared with a microphone, and suddenly his informal demonstration was being broadcast to the whole festival. "The key," he explained, holding up the restored violin, "is understanding that every instrument has its own voice, its own story. Our job isn't just to fix the physical damage, but to preserve that voice, to help continue that story." The violin's owner, Jessica, stepped forward to play a brief piece, the instrument's tone pure and true. The crowd applauded, and Mark saw several other musicians patting their instrument cases, perhaps thinking of repairs they'd been postponing. Then it was time for Sarah's performance. The temporary stage had been positioned perfectly, with the workshop as a backdrop. She stepped out in a simple blue dress, her flute catching the afternoon light. "Before I play," she said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident, "I want to tell you about this flute. A few weeks ago it was broken, and with it my heart was a little broken too, but in this workshop both were repaired by someone who understood that fixing things is really about fixing connections between people, between past and present, between what we dream and what we can become." The piece she played wasn't the Bach from her audition, but rather a new composition she'd been working on with Margaret Woodward's guidance. It wove together classical themes with something more personal, echoes of Chinese folk songs her grandfather might have heard in his watch shop, hints of the workshop's rhythmic sounds, and through it all, a thread of hope and renewal. Mark watched the audience's faces as she played. He saw parents dabbing at their eyes, musicians nodding in appreciation, and neighbours beaming with pride. This was what Catherine had always understood about music, what his father had taught him about repair work, that at its heart, it was all about connection. The festival continued into evening, the overhead lights twinkling on as the sun set. Mr. Chen's dumplings and Mrs. Rodriguez's tamales disappeared equally fast, while Mr. Patterson found himself promising to start a weekly book club focused on craft and restoration techniques. As the crowd began to thin, Mark felt a gentle touch on his arm. Victoria stood there, her professional polish softened by genuine emotion. "You've built something remarkable here," she said softly. "Not just the center, but this community, this feeling of possibility." Mark looked around at his expanded family, Emma and Sarah chatting with Miguel about an antique radio he was restoring, the neighbors who had become partners in this venture, the students eager to learn the art of repair. "We all built it," he replied. "Sometimes the most important tools are the connections we forge along the way." Above them, the stars began to appear, each one a point of light in the gathering darkness. Much like the festival lights below, small beacons of hope and renewal illuminating the path forward. Winter settled over Cedar Grove, but the workshop remained warm with activity and newfound connections. Victoria and Sarah had found a small house just 2 blocks away, close enough for Sarah to stop by after school, but far enough to maintain. Everyone's independence. The renovation crews worked through the cold, their progress visible in the rising walls of the new Technical Arts Center. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Mark looked up from a delicate music box repair to find his workshop fuller than usual. Emma sat at her homework desk, occasionally consulting with Sarah about a math problem. Victoria had claimed her usual corner, laptop open but largely ignored, as she watched Miguel demonstrate a technique to a visiting student. "It's like a dance," Miguel was explaining, his hands moving confidently over the mechanical parts. A piece has its own rhythm, its own way of moving with the others." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly how it feels when you're playing in an orchestra. Everything has to move together or nothing works right." The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Rodriguez entered, stamping snow from her boots. She carried her usual basket, but today she also brought a small package wrapped in faded paper. "Miguel," she called to her grandson, "I found something in the attic, your grandfather's old watchmaking tools. I thought perhaps—" She trailed off, emotion catching in her throat. Miguel carefully set down the piece he was working on and crossed to his grandmother. Together, they unwrapped the package, revealing a worn leather case containing precision instruments that spoke of years of careful use. "He would be so proud," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, watching Miguel gently touch each tool. "To see you learning, carrying on the tradition of fixing precious things." Victoria looked up from her laptop, her expression soft with understanding. "My father's tools are in storage in San Francisco," she said quietly. "I've been thinking of having them shipped here for the center's historical collection, but maybe," she glanced at Sarah, "maybe they should be used instead of displayed." Mark watched these interactions, seeing the threads of connection strengthening between them all. The workshop had always been a place of repair, but now it was becoming something more. A place where families could heal, where traditions could bridge generations, where new bonds could form around the shared value of making broken things whole again. Emma caught his eye and smiled, understanding. They didn't need words to acknowledge how their own small family had expanded, enriched by these new connections. The loss of Catherine would always be there, but the space around that loss had grown warmer, filled with new forms of love and support. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping their corner of the world in quiet white. Inside, the workshop hummed with the gentle sounds of repair work, quiet conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter. It wasn't just objects being fixed anymore. It was hearts, hopes, and histories, all carefully mended and made stronger at the places that had once been broken. Symphony Hall glowed with warmth against the winter evening as families filed in for the regional youth orchestra competition. In the green room, Sarah stood with her flute case, surrounded by her newly expanded support system. Mark, carefully, gave the instrument one final check, though he'd already inspected it thoroughly that morning. "Remember," he said, adjusting a key spring that only his trained eye could see was slightly off, "it's not just about the notes. It's about the story you're telling." Victoria squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Your grandfather used to say something similar about his watch repairs, that each tick carried a story forward in time." Emma, who had insisted on coming despite a mountain of homework waiting at home, added, "You've got this, Sarah. That flute's been through worse and came out singing." Mark watched as Sarah took the stage, noting how she held herself differently, now more confident, more connected to her instrument. As she began to play, he could hear in every note the journey they'd all taken together. The music spoke of broken things made whole, of connections restored, of new beginnings built on carefully preserved foundations. In the audience, the Chen Foundation board members sat alongside Mrs. Rodriguez, Miguel, and other workshop regulars. They were no longer just observers or supporters, but part of the extended family that had grown around a simple act of repair. When Sarah finished playing, the hall erupted in applause. But it was her smile, bright and genuine, that told the real story of victory, not just in competition, but in finding her voice, her community, her sense of belonging. Later, as they celebrated at Mr. Chen's restaurant, the golden medal around, Sarah's neck caught the light, much like her flute had on that first morning of repair. Mark looked around at the faces gathered there, his daughter, Victoria, Sarah, their neighbors and friends, and understood that sometimes the most important competitions aren't won on stage, but in the quiet moments of healing and connection that lead up to it. Spring arrived with a surge of new life at the Technical Arts Center. The renovation was complete, transforming Mark's humble workshop into something that somehow managed to be both grander and just as welcoming. The original workshop space remained largely unchanged, but it now opened into a larger facility where students learned the art of repair. On this particular morning, Mark stood in the doorway between old and new, watching Miguel guide a group of apprentices through the basics of mechanical movement. Through the windows, he could see the cafe where Mr. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez had combined their culinary talents, creating a space where students and craftspeople could gather and share stories. "Mr. Davidson," a young apprentice approached, holding a violin bow with reverence. "I think I understand now what you meant about feeling the history in these repairs." Mark smiled, remembering his own moments of discovery. The center had already welcomed students from across the country, each bringing their own stories and broken treasures to repair. But more importantly, they brought their passion for learning, for preserving, for understanding the delicate art of making things whole. Again, Victoria appeared beside him, her tablet in hand, but her attention on the students. "The foundation board is amazed by what we've accomplished here," she said softly. "They're talking about using this as a model for other communities." The workshop's original wall of repair tags had grown, spreading into the new space, but maintaining its personal touch. Each repair still got its own tag, its own story, its own place in the continuing narrative of renewal and restoration. Emma, home from her college visit to a prestigious engineering school, was showing Sarah her acceptance letter. Their friendship had deepened into something like sisterhood, strengthened by shared experiences and mutual understanding of what it meant to be part of this unique family. Outside, the spring breeze carried the mingled scents of cherry blossoms and fresh coffee from the cafe, while the sound of practice instruments and careful repair work created its own kind of symphony. The Technical Arts Center had become exactly what they'd hoped, not just a school, but a community, a place where broken things and broken spirits could find their way back to harmony. 1 year to the day after Sarah first brought her broken Flute to Mark's workshop, the Technical Arts Center hosted a special concert in the Catherine Davidson Memorial Hall. The space, with its perfect acoustics and warm wooden panels, had quickly become a favorite venue for local musicians. Sarah stood on stage, her flute catching the light, just as it had that first morning. But now she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by other young musicians whose instruments had all passed through the center's careful restoration program. Together, they played a piece that Margaret Woodward had commissioned specifically for the anniversary, titled The Repair Shop Symphony. In the audience, Mark sat between Emma and Victoria, listening to the music that seemed to tell their story. He could hear echoes of his workshop sounds in the percussion, the gentle ring of his tools in the triangle, the steady rhythm of repair work in the strings. Miguel sat with his grandmother, both of them beaming with pride. He had developed into an exceptional instructor, combining his natural mechanical ability with the patience he'd learned from Mark. Mrs. Rodriguez had taken to bringing her tamales to every student recital, while Mr. Chen's dumplings had become a mandatory part of the center's graduation ceremonies. The foundation's investment had paid off beyond anyone's expectations, but the true measure of success wasn't in the numbers or accolades. It was in moments like this, when music and craftsmanship came together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. After the concert, as families and friends mingled in the reception area, Mark found himself back in his original workshop space. The familiar tools still hung in their places. The worn workbench still stood ready for the next repair. Some things hadn't changed, and that was exactly as it should be. A small sound made him turn. Sarah stood in the doorway, her flute case in hand, smiling at some private thought. "I was just remembering," she said, "how scared I was that first day, bringing you my broken flute. I never imagined where it would lead." None of them had imagined it, Mark thought. But sometimes the best repairs were the ones that surprised you, that grew beyond the original break to create something entirely new and wonderful. As twilight settled over Cedar Grove, Mark stood in his workshop doorway, watching the last of the anniversary concert attendees make their way home. The Technical Arts Center hummed with the gentle afterglow of celebration, while strings of lights twinkled in Mr. Chen's cafe garden. Emma appeared at his side, her college acceptance letter still tucked in her pocket. "Mum would have loved this," she said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "All of it. She does love it," Mark replied, his voice warm with certainty. "Every time someone brings in something precious to repair, every time a student learns to make something whole again, that's her legacy living on." Through the window, they could see Victoria and Sarah walking in the garden, their heads close together in conversation. The distance that had once existed between them had been repaired as surely as any broken instrument. Their relationship, stronger for having been carefully restored. Miguel was closing up the student workshop, his grandfather's tools now well used, but still cherished. Under his guidance, a new generation was learning that some things were worth taking time to fix properly. Mark touched the worn edge of his workbench, feeling the smooth spot where decades of careful work had polished the wood. Some things changed, and some remained the same, and wisdom lay in knowing the difference. Just as every repair taught a Lesson: every ending opened the door to a new beginning. In the quiet of the evening, the workshop held its memories like treasures. A broken flute that led to healing, a community that came together to build something extraordinary, and the endless possibility of making broken things whole again.